I've been uploading videos of garden preparation at the Sustainable Homestead Institute demonstration garden. And I want to answer some of the questions that keep coming up about the use of equipment and the appropriateness of certain types of garden activities. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. So I get a question. First off, there's a video about preparing spring organic garden beds for plant starts. We grew cover crops last year because the soil is still very much Virginia clay, and what we need is more biomass in the soil. Now, with the cost of straw and other productive uses of straw, for example, feeding animals, hay, feeding animals, we'd much rather grow hay or use or buy in hay to feed animals, which then create manure, which becomes fertilizer for the garden. Because remember, we're working with very low inputs and trying to maximize our outputs. So what we did is we grew cover crop on the beds, and then I flail mowed the cover crop real close to the ground, which gives us kind of a 4 to 6 inch strips of the material kind of all chopped up and beat to death. And that gives us the biomass that we're looking for in the soil. Now, again, one season of cover crops is not going to give you a lot of organic material, but it gives you some. And then to terminate the cover crop, because we're going to plant into it small plant starts, I basically did like a shallow tillage, about a 1 inch to 3 inches of tillage in order to just break up the plants. So we had winter rye, we had clover, hairy vetch, pigeon peas, all kinds of stuff in there. And if we plant little 4-inch tall plants and the cover crop can grow faster than the small plants, then we're going to have a lot of weeding later. So the point I want to make in today's podcast is that we want to look at appropriate technologies and appropriate periods of interaction with the land. So I get a question, are these beds new that you're tilling? And do you need to do this process yearly? It's not about the process. First off, we work with soil conditions. So the soil's been there for hundreds of years, and it has some organic matter in it. It has some biology in it. But in the case of Virginia red clay, we do have to lime the soil. Now, do we have to lime it every year? Well, we take a soil test to know whether or not we need to lime it every year. The percentage of organic matter, we would prefer to have high organic matter, because if you have high organic matter, you don't necessarily need cover crops. You can you can grow cover crops someplace else and then cut that manure and put it on the beds, basically green manure, and put it on the beds. Or you can mineralize through animal manures, or you can compost and then just layer out the beds, maintaining a large organic matter, which on the surface would be almost 100% organic matter. That's your mulch. Well, once you've built up a mulch layer on top of your beds, there's really no need to till it, because, again, we're designing permanent raised beds. We don't walk on the beds. There's no compaction. And if there is compaction, we open it up with a broad fork. So, again, over time, you won't need the tillage to terminate the cover crop, because a cover crop simply will not grow on the beds that have a high level of organic matter on their surface. Now, of course, you can move the plant material aside. So imagine you covered a bed with straw. You can move the straw aside and put your little plant start in there. And because you don't have competing elements, the little plant start will do what it needs to do. So I want you to look at your garden areas or your growing spaces as holistic ecosystems, that we want to look at the soil nature. We want to look at the plants that grow well there. We want to look at other criteria and then apply equipment appropriately. So in these raised beds, we do have some weird wiregrass that really gets everywhere, and the cover crops help us choke out the wiregrass. We have areas of compaction, and when you have more than 1,000 foot of rows, using a broad fork, you're not going to broad fork the whole thing, but you can plant daikon radish, and daikon radish will break up the soil. You also want to look at what materials are we having. So it's April 2022, and for a square bale of straw, it's $7.25. A square bale of straw will maybe cover lightly 100 feet of bed, about 4 foot wide. And if you've got 1,000 feet of bed, some beds as wide as 12 feet, or some growing areas as wide as 12 feet, it's not cost effective to buy in that much straw. Again, we have to make decisions with our homestead. If you've got small animals or even cows, it's more cost effective to buy in hay to feed the animals rather than to grow straw or to buy in a lot of straw, because feeding the animal puts on more calorie density, plus creates a byproduct of the manures, which then can be used to fertilize the garden. And a manure is more broken down. Turn it a couple times in a compost pile, you've got more crumbly material, you've got better soil structure, and then you can simply layer that onto your garden beds. If you have weeds or other types of plants that are not desirable for your growing areas, the other approach is to till it one time and then put cover crops in place. And those cover crops will choke out the other plants. But again, you can't till under the cover crop because then you're going to bring those weed seeds up. We have to recognize that permanent raised beds are giant batteries full of seeds. They're seeds that blown in. They're leftover seeds and plants and materials from what you've planted there. There are seeds that have gone dormant, that haven't found the right conditions. We're not tilling these beds because we don't want to keep bringing those seeds to the surface. And when we build up the level of soil biology and we build up the level of carbon in the soil, we don't want to keep bringing that up to atmosphere, because if we bring it up to atmosphere, we lose some of it. So again, it's not about whether we till every year or whether we till a certain depth or whether we leave a bed idle or whether we apply manures or not apply manures. And this is kind of a parody I see on the parody as in a joke. You know, a lot of people are attracted to videos about what to do next. It's really about understanding what that land needs in order to express itself more fully. So in the case of the market garden at the Sustainable Homestead Institute, it is a market garden. It's got rows that are 50 feet long. It's got a couple rows that are 300 feet long. You can drive a truck into the middle of the garden because, you know, hauling a wheelbarrow full of stuff up a hill is not all that fun. The top half of it is sloped. The bottom half is more level. You have to apply a different regiment of testing and observation than you would for the 12 by 12 garden that's near my house. And the 12 by 12 garden, while it's sloped, it has permanent raised beds. I tilled it one time, I mounded the beds, I made the contour paths, and then done. I never have to till that again. I don't even have to broad fork it because ultimately I'm using this lasagna layering method in that smaller space. But in the smaller space with a 12-foot bed, that's 12 foot by 4 foot wide. It takes like a half a bale of straw to cover that up, and it's a more intense garden area. Where the market garden, on the other hand, might have a row of, for example, corn, beans, and squash. It could have a row of that's like 50 feet long. It could have 12 feet wide by 150 feet long corn. It's a different type of environment, and the land supports it because the land is broader. It's got bigger, wider areas. It would be not very time efficient to plow out or to till out a whole acre and then mound it in beds every season when you're burning the fuel, you're destroying soil biology, you're turning over the different layers of soil. So we've kind of hybridized the method to approach a broad acreage with appropriate technology. So we're using a BCS tractor instead of a large tractor. Now, if this was a 20-acre garden instead of a 2-acre garden, then a tractor might be more appropriate, but now we're adjusting the height of the tillage. So in some cases, you may not even till. You may just crimp down. So when you can mechanically seed, you might actually just crimp down the cover crops and then mechanically seed through that cover crop, and then you could have enough speed of growth because the matted material is basically killing itself. You can have the speed of growth necessary to have your crop come up. But again, not every crop will come up like that. So some areas still need to have some kind of tillage, some kind of mulching or layering. For example, our cut flower beds, we only flail mow those. We don't till them anymore. So they were tilled one time, put the cut flowers in, and now we flail mow it in the off season when all the cut flowers are dead. And then we just come back and apply mulch. Because again, we don't want a soil disturbance because there's bulbs under there. And plus the soil disturbance tends to mess up the different layers of earth. Now, one thing about this shallow tillage that's useful, especially on a broad acre market garden, is that I can adjust the BCS tiller to till just 1 inch. Now, I might go over the beds more than once, so that 1 inch going one way and then the other way becomes 2 inches, maybe even 3 inches. But the point of it is those soil layers could be 4 to 6 inches deep. So I'm not tilling down far enough in order to even hit the potatoes that still might be under the ground there. I'm basically scratching up the surface, no different than what chickens would do, no different than what impacting or impounding animals on there might do. I'm simply stirring up the surface to terminate the cover crop, to level the beds out, and then get them ready for us to plant. So again, it's not about what are you going to do every year. It's about what are the conditions of the soil. What's the difference between the condition it is in now and where we'd like it to be? And what is the appropriate step to move towards that outcome we're looking for? Now, if you're going to manage a small farm, a homestead, or even an estate property, you've got to be able to convey this to your teams because it seems easier just to deep till everything and then add some fertilizer and add some, whatever you need to add to it to get a garden going. We don't want that because we know there are drawbacks to that. There's problems with infections in the soil if you don't have the right soil biology. You can have issues if you don't properly crop rotate. Ultimately, what we use on the garden demonstrations that we have is true to seed, basically heritage breed plants. So the plants grow and we let some of them go to seed. So we have seeds for the next year. We're using regenerative land practices where, for example, the vegetative strips are there for erosion control as much as they're there for creating biomass that will later layer on the beds. It is a holistic system. Now, that's why it's so important for you to go see these demonstrations in person. You can watch all the videos you want on YouTube, but you're still not going to understand that the soil tilth, that we're building organic soil, and you can see the color differences in the soil. You can see the amount of materials in the soil. You can see the difference between burying. If you bury wood chips, for example, they don't rot. There's no air, so they become a little bit nasty and wet and soggy and stuff. But that might be useful if you're doing deep bedding for animals, and that deep bedding was going to get turned over a couple times before it goes out in the garden as compost. But it's not useful if you're tilling under a large amount of organic material. So again, I'm not tilling under the organic material. It's been flail mowed and it's simply being incorporated into the surface of the soil. But for all sites and purposes, it's still on the surface of the soil. All we've done is basically cut off the plants that were there so that they don't grow back and compete with the new plants that we're putting in. Can you see how this is a little bit different than what might be popular online? Can you see how this can help you have the minimal amount of inputs to a property while yielding maximum outputs? And can you see how over time we actually reduce the amount of work that we need to do because you'll start observing things like the beds have enough organic material that it chokes out any weeds. It's just like taking rocks out of the bed. Over time, as you remove the rocks from your garden bed, there are fewer rocks in the garden bed. They won't walk back over there and get back in the thing. You're simply preparing the soil in place. And you'll even have interesting soil profiles. So, for example, on terraced beds, you'll find that the main bed area will have rich organic material, but the buns, which is the edge of the bed that is basically the shelf, that area will remain clay because you need the structure of clay in order to hold back the loose organic material that will actually become water saturated if water stands on it or as water soaks through it. It's really exciting to see this in action But once you see it in the cycles of action, you'll start noticing how you can own larger pieces of property. You can garden larger garden areas. You can grow a higher volume of food. You can incorporate livestock of various types. And you ultimately are starting to get that massive return on investment. The less you have to put into a garden and still maintain the output, the greater the return on that investment. That's one of the profits we talk about. That holistic ecology, that soil biology that makes the plants grow fast. Now, again, you can 10-10-10 and drop nitrogen fertilizer and drop all this chemical fertilizer on your property, and you will get short-term results. But what we're teaching here is about generational wealth in the land, as well as what you've done with the land or what the land does for you. And that's a different perspective. That's a perspective that's sometimes difficult to teach because it seems like it's taken a long time. But ultimately, you're going to get way more out than what you've put in. And it'll serve you for many, many more years than that quick pump and dump that most people do today. Plus, food security, plus environmental protection and enhancement of your personal health and well-being. You win hundreds of times over using the methods we teach here at Prosperity Homestead. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. If you have questions about what I've covered today, visit me at www.prosperityhomestead.org. There'll be a link in the description to the video I was referencing, Preparing Spring Organic Garden Beds for Plant Starts. And, contact us with your questions. I'd love to hear from you. If you've got 5 or more acres in a homestead, small farm, or an estate, I'd like to help you get more from that land. Not only increase the property values, but reduce the amount of dependency you have on outside resources and increase the value of that land from its production capacity, and to do so with a minimal amount of effort and inputs. It really needs to be part of the lifestyle, not an extra chore that you've got to do on top of everything else. So thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions. I've got a lot of free resources that you simply just got to ask a question and I'll get for you. Because again, this is the stuff that's transformational. This is the stuff that you can look back on and see what you've built. And these are the insights that can never be taken away. Thanks for listening.